Today we're talking about Hegel's theory of world history and the development of spirit within it. For Hegel, reason rules the world. Therefore, world history is a rational process. World history for Hegel is the gradual emergence of spirit in the world as freedom. As such, world history tracks the increasing freedom and self-consciousness of human beings. In other words, world history is the unfolding of spirit in time. So, what is spirit? Well, spirit, or Geist in German, is the engine of history. It's a sort of principle of activity and motion, or as Hegel calls it, self-consciousness coming to know itself. Now, this might sound very abstract, like, where is the spirit? What is it? But for Hegel, it's really permeating everything in the world. It's not some kind of mysterious woo-woo force, but rather the truth of movement, development, activity. Things are always changing. They're always in a process of becoming. We can never say with certainty that this thing is what it is, and it is fixed that way. Hegel's trying to get, through his notion of spirit, at the insight that the world is always in flux, in a state of change. And this is an interesting point when you think about history, because the claim is that history is actually essential for understanding the way things are. There's not some sort of permanent, eternal, unchanging truth, and then history is sort of the predetermined way that unfolds chronologically. No, rather, the way things are is historical in its very being. Spirit, as this principle of activity that is driving things, is also driving them forward to a certain end for Hegel. History is teleological on his view, which is a term that came up in the lecture on Kant. Teleological means aiming towards a certain logical, reasonable end. And so, for Hegel, things are always in a state of progress, to put it simply. Spirit is driving towards freedom. So Hegel describes freedom as the truth of spirit and says that when we talk about world history as spirit actualizing itself in concrete events throughout history, through individual people's desires, what we're actually saying is that spirit is becoming more and more concrete. And this means that things are becoming freer. They're unifying, becoming more self-conscious. And when we are self-conscious, we are able to rule ourselves, govern ourselves. And that is the truth of freedom for Hegel. The goal towards which spirit is driving is thus, in a sense, freedom. But specifically speaking, Hegel really talks about it as the idea, which is another notion that comes up a lot in Hegel's work. The idea for Hegel is the synthesis of subjectivity and objectivity, synthesis of matter and spirit, synthesis of really all these things that seem disparate and separate. And the idea actually needs human activity in order to help bring it about. It's not something sort of hovering up in the ether that needs to, enter human history in some way. No, it is actually immanent within human history, and it needs human activity in order to self-actualize. So humans have an essential role in the self-development of spirit as it strives for its goal, which is the idea. The goal of world history is the fulfillment of the concept of spirit. Spirit is conscious of its own freedom, and it has actualized freedom completely. And that is also what Hegel calls the idea. So one thing you'll find is that it's easy to get sort of caught up in these different terms, but Hegel is really just trying to get at this notion that history is in a state of development, and that this state of development is immanent within the conditions of the world. It doesn't need sort of something outside of it. For Hegel, the means are always internal to the end. On page 26, Hegel says that the idea and human passion are the two elements of world history. And they come together concretely in the freedom that we receive through living within a state. The idea, as we said earlier, is the synthesis of subjectivity and objectivity. It's the totality of all things. But its antithesis is passion. Passion is the arbitrary, free, or subjective will, say, of an individual person. And passion, Hegel says, even though it's antithetical to the idea, has a role to play in the actualization of reason. It provides a sort of driving force in what Hegel calls the cunning of reason. So think about the way that as a person, you have individual interests, you have individual desires, you have individual goals, and those might seem to be unique to you, right? Hegel says, well, in trying to attain those desires, you are actually unwittingly doing the work of reason. You are helping actualize spirit in the world, even though you don't know it. And even if you're not doing good actions, our actions, Hegel says, have meaning outside of our intentions and even outside of the specific actions we undertake. So he gives the example, for instance, of an arsonist who lights a house on fire in order to get revenge, say it's the house of his enemy, but then accidentally ends up lighting an entire neighborhood on fire and destroying a lot of property and even killing people on the way. Hegel says that person's actions had all sorts of consequences that that person didn't intend. And this is where Hegel's seeming optimism starts to get a little dark, because he talks about, for instance, the slaughter bench of history. Reason uses human passions in order to attain its own end, and in so doing, a lot of individual humans end up not attaining their goals or end up being destructive or even being destroyed. In this picture that Hegel gives of individuals being the unwitting instruments of reason, he focuses on a particular type of person whom he calls the world historical individual, or the hero. The world historical individual is a person whose aims embody a universal concept. They contain the will of the world spirit. So there are plenty of people whose particular passions, even though they're still part of this teleological progress of history, aren't particularly useful for reason. So for instance, if my particular passion is to create a small business in my community, maybe it's a used car dealership, then, in achieving that, I'm still part of the progress of history, according to Hegel, but I have a somewhat localized effect. There are others, however, whose effects go far beyond what they even could have anticipated. Perhaps it's somebody who starts a movement, or somebody who lives a kind of quiet life while they're alive, but then afterward becomes venerated as a hero and ends up embodying a value that then culture really takes to and furthers for centuries to come. A lot of religious figures are like this. Hegel says that for these individuals, the source of their actions comes from inner spirit. It's actually hidden to them themselves. So world historical individuals may or may not believe that they have an important mission to accomplish. And it doesn't really matter whether they do or not for Hegel, because at the end of the day, they are bringing the idea into consciousness out of themselves, even when they're not aware of it. Let's say something now about the state. For Hegel, the state is the object of world history. And what he means by the state is actually pretty broad. So he's not just talking about government here, although that's part of it. He's also talking about all dimensions of cultural life, right? Arts, religion, philosophy, education. In addition, he talks about ethical life. And ethical life doesn't strictly mean here our moral actions. It actually just means our norms, our ways of living, our customs, right? It's Sittlichkeit in German. And it also pertains to our environment. So the state for Hegel actually even extends to our climate, our geography, and which countries surround us as our neighbors. And finally, it pertains to something we'll talk about a little bit next time, which is the Volksgeist, or the spirit of a people. Geist, spirit, Volk, people. For Hegel, the state is freedom that is actually rationally self-conscious. And one thing that's important here is Hegel's claim that only within the state can freedom be actualized. So this is in contrast, say, with a pretty common conception of freedom that we have, which is that in the state of nature, humans are completely free, But we're also pretty violent, and infringing on each other's desires all the time. And so what we need to do is to enter a society where our freedoms are constrained. So I can retain certain freedoms, but I can't retain the freedom to kill another person. That notion wherein the state is what constrains your freedom, but freedom is something you have naturally because it's just the freedom to follow your desires, is very different from what Hegel has in mind. Hegel says, no, freedom requires self-consciousness and it requires recognition within a community. So it's actually only through the state, which includes all of those things I mentioned a little bit ago, not just government, but also cultural life and ethical life and so on and so forth. Only there do I actually have the freedom that Hegel's talking about. And in a perfect world, he says on page 27, the state's universal goal is in union with the private interests of citizens. Of course, doesn't often work out that way. For Hegel, the state is the practical and lived union of the universal and the particular. And what holds people together in the state is reason. So this is what makes the state different, say, from the family structure. Hegel says that the family structure is based on blood ties or kinship ties, right? Whereas the state is based on ties of reason, which are universal. And if this all still sounds pretty abstract, think about the fact that we encounter reason through the state in a literal physical sense, right? By encountering laws, for instance. Or say I'm going to a national park to go climbing and I have to stop at a kiosk and pay my way in, right? That's a way of me encountering the state. I'm saying, okay, I'll pay $20 in order to support the upkeep of the park so I can go climbing here and keep it accessible for everybody. Or when I'm driving down the highway. Driving down the highway is a great example of the state structure and the fact that it enables freedom for me because it allows me to get from point A to point B much more quickly than if we didn't have the infrastructure providing for that. You can also see the state structure embodied in individuals who do service for the state. Say a judge. Looking forward to talking to you about Hegel this week. Recall that for Hegel, spirit is the engine of world history. Spirit actualizes itself throughout the course of historical events. In the reading for today, we get a really interesting articulation of this, which is the idea that spirit does this. It serves as the engine of world history through self-estrangement, basically by alienating itself. Hegel says that spirit stands in opposition to itself, presenting its own hindrance to itself, and it must overcome itself throughout the course of world history. This is weirdly paradoxical, right? Hegel talks about this on the bottom of 59 and on page 60. He says that spirit only makes itself into what it is implicitly. And yet the development of spirit is immanent within world history itself. So it's not as if spirit is sort of standing apart like an all-knowing God who has the course of history charted out in advance. It's not like that. It's actually this weird motion, this principle of creating something like the way that an oak tree starts off as a seed and it has everything that it needs in order to develop, right, under the right conditions. But we can't say that the seed itself is already the oak tree, right? It is the oak tree implicitly. Spirit's self-actualization is implicit within itself, but needs the course of human history through human activity and subjective will or passion to realize itself. The highest achievement of spirit is ultimately to know itself, Hegel says on page 75. Spirit wants to be self-conscious of itself by taking itself as its own object. And it can only do so through thinking itself. So spirit's movement is this process of externalizing itself in different formations, reflecting on itself, and then sort of overcoming that formation, that relationship, and creating a new reflection. This is what's known as dialectic. Hegel is known for a dialectical method of philosophy. And so what I've been saying so far is sort of challenging to grasp. Understandable. Hegel is famously difficult to grasp. So let me give you a useful heuristic that a lot of people use while teaching Hegel, but with the caveat that this particular schema is somewhat oversimplified and you're not going to find it that often in Hegel himself. This is the schema of dialectics known as the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. According to Hegel, history is driven by opposites. You have a thesis, A, an antithesis, B, and those things are mutually incompatible. What happens is that because of that incompatibility, a tension arises that ultimately leads to the collapse of that opposition. But when that opposition collapses, it's not as if the thesis and antithesis just fall away. Rather, their moment of collapse is sort of preserved at a higher level, which is the synthesis, the Aufhebung in German, or the sublation. This word sublation basically implies that something is superseded, it's moved beyond, but it's preserved at the same time. So for Hegel, all of the past moments and oppositions of world history are in a sense present in the present moment, but they are present as having been superseded. So an example that Hegel gives is in terms of structures of government. He talks about despotic monarchy, where one person is ruling, as being a kind of thesis. That's a first moment of state formation. And then that despotic monarchy gets opposed by a different kind of government, which is democracy, where the people are ruling rather than one person ruling. So we have this opposition between monarchy and democracy. But monarchy and democracy not only are in tension with each other, but they're also internally in tension, according to Hegel. Monarchy is in tension with itself because it relies on the obedience of the people, but it doesn't give the people a voice. And he says that democracy is in tension with itself because by letting people rule themselves, passion and caprice run free. They're not appropriately guided by reason. So we have a thesis of despotic monarchy and an antithesis of democracy, and Hegel says that these collapse because they're both in tension with themselves and in tension with each other and lead to constitutional monarchy, which is basically Hegel's ideal of government. Here he thinks we have the rule of the people through a constitution, but then we also have a single person ruling who is paradoxically, by virtue of being an individual, representing everybody, and that's the monarch. This is far from the only example of a thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure, but it is one that comes up in the reading for today. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to Marx as well. Hegel summarizes his dialectical view on page 60. Here, he says about 3/4 of the way down the page that the process of history appears to be an advance from the imperfect to the more perfect. There we have the developmental, progressive view of history we've been talking about. But in this transition from the imperfect to the more perfect, Hegel says that the imperfect stage is to be grasped as having the perfect within itself. The imperfect stages of history are internally driven by having a perfect stage of history implicit within them, in the same way that the seed of the oak tree has the oak tree implicit within it. And the sublation or synthesis is kind of a funny concept because it can mean both preservation and negation. So the tension between opposites is negated, right? It collapses, as we said, but it also is preserved. It had a partial truth to it that persists into the present. On page 60, Hegel talks about stages in the development of spirit. And he says that we first go from the immersion of spirit in natural life, right? So spirit is just completely implicit within nature, to a second stage where spirit emerges into consciousness and freedom. But even that second stage of emerging into consciousness and freedom, gaining a certain reflective dimension, right? Spirit is able to reflect on itself, is not the end goal. Ultimately, these two moments, which we can even think about as the thesis and antithesis, get sublated into a third stage, which is spirit in its universality and self-consciousness. Here, spirit unifies the subjective with the objective and becomes fully free. Now here's where it gets pretty colonialist. Hegel talks about the Volksgeist. Remember, that's one of the principles that I mentioned in my video for last week. The Volksgeist is the spirit of a people. Hegel says that spirit works through individual peoples at individual moments of time. such that certain civilizations have a world historical role to play before then passing away. So for instance, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had a historical role to play on the slaughter bench of history and its increasing self-actualization of spirit into the idea, but then eventually its time was up, it decayed, and then was gone. The Volksgeist, or national spirit, spirit of a people, is only a particular phase of world spirit, Hegel says on page 82. Individual civilizations culminate in a particular thought or notion, right? A particular civilization has a kind of lifespan, according to Hegel. It's born, it reaches maturity, and then it dies. And whatever essential thought or contribution the civilization had to make becomes the kernel of rebirth for the next civilization. Hegel likens this to the image of the phoenix. And he says that the image of the phoenix comes from Asia, but because Hegel is extremely Eurocentric, he thinks that literally the culmination of world history is in Prussia in his time of living. He says a Western version of the phoenix is better because it's not just that the phoenix is reborn, but the phoenix is reborn as a purer and more spiritual being. Page 76. For Hegel, what brings about the decline or death of a people is habit. Habit or activity without opposition, just kind of going through the motions, are the first sign, according to him, that a people is in decline. And I'll just say that this progressivist view of history that Hegel offers, including its notion that history is forwarded by individual peoples, has a long and quite fraught legacy in subsequent philosophy. So for instance, you can hear resonances here of what will later become National Socialist rhetoric in Germany, right? The idea that the German people have a world historical mission to play. And then on the other side of things, there's somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, who in the early 20th century in America says that Black people in the US are now the world historical people that Hegel envisioned. What do you think about this Hegelian legacy and his focus on the way that world spirit gets actualized through individual peoples? And what in general of the progressivist or teleological notion of history? That things are always getting better due to an immanent, intrinsic law within material conditions of the world. In this video, I'll be discussing Hegel's notion of the master-servant dialectic as it emerges in his text, The Phenomenology of Spirit, in hopes that this will help you in your reading process of this text. Hegel's text, The Phenomenology of Spirit, is all about the different shapes that consciousness takes as it develops a sense of itself and leads to absolute knowing. If you're curious about how this relates to the dialectical process, I have a video on the dialectical method that I would recommend watching. But I think the master-servant dialectic is one of the ways, or one of the scenes in the Phenomenology of Spirit that has been particularly salient for people. It's probably the most famous section of the Phenomenology of Spirit. I don't really know how Hegel would feel about that. But in any case, it does have a particular kind of hold on a lot of people's imagination about the Phenomenology of Spirit and has been particularly influential on French intellectuals in the 20th century, especially those coming out of phenomenology and existentialism. Hegel sets the scene for us by saying that in order for consciousness to really emerge into self-consciousness, it has to be faced with another consciousness, another being. I can't develop a full self-consciousness if I don't encounter others. They're mutually constitutive. Hegel asks us to imagine a scene in which two consciousnesses are facing each other for the first time. And he thinks that this scene would fundamentally lead to conflict, specifically to a battle to the death. A lot of us like to go about our everyday lives kind of vaguely knowing that there are other people around, but really thinking that we're the only mind in the universe. And then sometimes things happen that disrupt that sense of sovereignty we have. And when those things happen, we feel fundamentally threatened. So Hegel says, oh my goodness, I suddenly come into contact with another person. I feel threatened, and my impulse is to kill them. Their impulse is to kill me. So the two people in this scene engage in a battle to the death. And ultimately, one of them asks for mercy. The person who asks for mercy, Hegel says, has begged for their life. And that means that the person who was on the receiving end of the begging, the person who didn't give up, ends up becoming the master. The person who did beg for their life ends up becoming the servant, sometimes translated as slave. So you'll see this sometimes as the master-slave dialectic, in part because early translations, especially translations into French of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, translated it as such. But nowadays it's translated as master-servant dialectic, the Knecht. You get it. Once this relationship is set up where one person is the master and one person is the servant, the master puts the servant to work. Let's say they tell the servant, okay, go work in the field, make sure that I have sustenance, make sure that I have food so I can, just go hang out. So the servant starts working the field. And in working the field, they are putting their own human spirit into the field. They are planting seeds. They are tending the field. They are externalizing themselves in the world. And in doing so, it seems like they're servile to the master, right? Because the master is giving them orders, but they actually come to have an independent relationship with what they're working on, such that they see in the field that they've been plowing, been tending, now are able to harvest from, an affirming sense of, hey, I've created this thing that is outside me. The servant is directly related to what they're working on, and the master is mediately related to it by virtue of the servant being the mediator. The master gets to enjoy the things that the servant has created, right? The vegetables that they have planted, tended, and then harvested, for instance, and that gives them a sense of affirmation as well. But by virtue of being mediated through the servant, the master's affirmation ultimately is dependent on the servant. The servant has been dependent on the master because the master was the one whom the servant begged for mercy. But ultimately, Hegel thinks the power differential inverts because the master is dependent upon the servant for their sustenance. In addition to that, the servant is also giving the master recognition as a master. So the master is only a master by virtue of being recognized as such by the servant. But the master is treating the servant as an instrument, as a thing. And so what ultimately ends up happening is that the master undermines their very desire for recognition, because recall that what they wanted from the life and death struggle was to be recognized as a consciousness, and specifically as a sovereign consciousness. But this requires being recognized by another subject. And so in treating the servant as an instrument or a thing, the master ends up undermining the potential for recognition because they can't be recognized by a thing. They need to be recognized by another subject. So not only does the master depend on the servant both for sustenance and for recognition, but they actually can't get the recognition that they need. And so the master's aims are doomed to be thwarted. They can't actually have the mastery that they want, which is the mastery of being recognized as a master by a subject. Meanwhile, as the servant is working the land and getting a sense of affirmation of selfhood through creatively transforming it, they also have a sense that they can transform themselves. They get a sense of their originality and their ability to shape not only the world around them, but also themselves. So for Hegel, being in service to something else is a kind of necessary apprenticeship for consciousness, because it allows us to take our sort of finite and contingent self and transform it into something that goes beyond what we originally thought was possible. It unlocks our creative potential. Thus, the servant ends up having more self-sufficiency than the master does. And so it seems like actually the servant is higher than the master. They've mastered nature and they've mastered themselves, and they don't actually need the master to help keep them alive. Now, of course, the servant would still need the recognition by the free subjectivity of the master in order to really achieve self-consciousness. And this is ultimately what Hegel thinks we can achieve through the state, a reciprocal recognition of consciousnesses. Thanks for checking out this video. You can take a look at our channel for more, as well as listen to our podcast, linked below. Marx is deeply indebted to Hegel's progressivist view of history. For Marx, as for Hegel, world history has a rational orientation towards freedom. But Marx wants to do away with the Hegelian talk of spirit and the idea. For Marx, what shapes history are the material conditions themselves. So Marx is known as a dialectical materialist because he holds on to the structure of dialectic that we discussed in Hegel, but he says that this dialectic is itself material and it happens through material conditions, rather than being about a relation between material conditions and spirit. Today we're talking about alienation and private property. Marx draws his famous notion of alienation in part from Hegel's notion of the self-estrangement of spirit, which I mentioned in the last video. Recall that spirit has to externalize itself in order to relate to itself and have its spirit reflected back to it. Well, Marx agrees with Hegel that this is a fundamental structure of self-consciousness, but he says that it is perverted under certain material conditions. And the material conditions that he's focused on here are those of capitalism. Let's first talk about self-estrangement that is non-alienated. Well, Marx says that humans are essentially practical, active beings, homo faber in Latin. We're always seeking to create. We're always building worlds. And we do so according to rational laws, right? We use our reason to create beautiful, productive things in the world. Now, let's say, for instance, that I do that by creating a vase. If I'm creating a vase, I have something in mind that I want to be able to use and enjoy. So I'm already geared towards that vase creation with a rational plan. Marx says this is something that humans just tend to do. So I say, okay, I've got some raw materials, I've got some clay, and I've got some paint, and I can form this vase into the shape that I want and a shape that I think would be useful for me. And then I can decorate it as I wish. And once I have created this vase, it is separate from me, right? It's no longer an idea in my head, but it's an actual thing out there in the world. And this is so affirming. It feels so good, Marx says. Because what I am doing when I see the vase as separate from me, when I put flowers in the vase, when I look at the vase on my shelf, I am affirming my very human nature as a creative, active being. What happens under the conditions of capitalism for Marx is that the laborer gets separated from the product of their labor. So it's no longer enough for me to just use and enjoy the vase myself. I actually have to sell the vase to somebody else. And although this is kind of a long and complicated process that Marx details not only in this work but in other works, the basic idea is that part of the reason I have to sell it is because usually I don't even own the raw materials anymore. Laborers under capitalism don't have access to the means of production. I don't have access to the clay that I need, to the paint that I need, and probably to maybe I need a kiln as well, right? So I have to use somebody else's means of production. For Marx, there's a separation under capitalism between the laborers and the owners of the means of production, or the capitalists. As a laborer, I have to sell my labor to a capitalist, and what I usually get in return for that is not the actual thing that I create. The vase doesn't go to me. The vase goes to the capitalist. And what do I receive in exchange for my labor power? Well, I receive wages. And one of the problems with wages for Marx is that they can't give me the kind of satisfaction or affirmation in my human nature as a productive being in the way that an actual product of my labor can. So on page 75, for instance, Marx says that the worker doesn't find a reflection of their own capacities in the object that they create. The object of my labor is not only not something that I usually get to take home if I'm a laborer, but it actually transforms in its character. It becomes a commodity. Let's talk a little bit about the kinds of value that Marx sees in objects and how they pertain to capitalism. For Marx, there are three primary forms of value: use value, exchange value, and surplus value. I've talked about the vase as being something that I can put flowers in and enjoy the look of from an aesthetic perspective. Those refer to the use value of my object. If you think about shoes, for instance, right? The use value of your shoes is that they protect your feet as you walk down the street. But there is a second kind of value that a lot of economic systems utilize, not just capitalism, although capitalism is one of them, and that is exchange value. The exchange value of this vase is how much I can sell it for on the market, right? And so I try and get, let's say, $30 for this vase, because I say, well, the clay costs $2 and the paint costs $3, and then I put 2 hours of work into it, and so I'm gonna sort of add that up and let it be $30. And whether or not that's a fair price is determined by the laws of supply and demand on the market. Does this price seem comparable to that of other vases that are the same size and skill level, etc.? The third kind of value, surplus value, is really where capitalism gets going. Surplus value is how much more I can get for the vase beyond the sum of its labor cost and material cost. If I can sell the vase for $35, then I get to go home with that $5 in my pocket and I've more than broken even. But of course, the way I've just described it presumes that I, as the laborer, am the one who's getting the surplus value. That's not how things work. Marx says that surplus value gets off the ground through laborers selling their labor power to capitalists. Basically, if I own a vase factory, I'm a capitalist, I can say, okay, I'm gonna buy in bulk all of this clay, all of this paint, I have the kilns, and I'm gonna hire a bunch of workers. How do I decide how much to pay my workers? Well, I decide based on what Marx calls average labor power. Let's say that the average person is able to create half a vase in an hour. Well, I'm going to then calculate how much I'm gonna pay them based on the price of half a vase minus the material costs, which include also the cost of wear, say, on the kiln, right? You can only use a kiln so many times. But when I actually go to sell the vase on the market, I'm not just going to sell it according to how much it costs to pay the worker plus the cost of materials. I'm also going to add a little bit extra, and that's going to be my surplus value. Capitalism functions through the accumulation of wealth, which is only possible if you have a surplus value to goods. But the surplus value of goods is only possible if you pay laborers a little bit less than however much they're worth, frankly. Because the surplus value can't come out of the material costs, right? Clay costs however much clay is going to cost, and paint costs however much paint is going to cost. But labor is a changeable commodity. It's fluid. It's determined by how much capitalists are willing to give laborers. And so you can already see here that for Marx, capitalism is not a value-neutral system because it's possible only through the exploitation of laborers. Now, what does this mean for the laborer? Well, for Marx, it means that the laborer becomes alienated. And alienation is psychologically a very painful thing. He lays out some of the basic ideas of alienation on page 58. The first is that the worker themselves sinks to the level of a commodity. The worker gets paid for working, right? They don't get paid for a product within the economy of exchange. They are paid for their labor power. And that means that all the worker is good for is their ability to do work. In the same way that all this vase is good for is my ability to use it and enjoy it. And Marx says that the laborer is actually the most miserable commodity. What's worse, the misery of the worker is proportional to the power and volume of their production. So the more I externalize myself through products, that are alienated from me because all I get in return for them are paltry wages and I never actually am able to enjoy the vase that I make, the more miserable I've become because I am putting my human essence, my being as a creative, productive individual into the object, but I don't get anything of equal value in return. And so the more I give, the more I am exploited. Marx also says that the competition among capitalists, say to turn out better and more products at cheaper and cheaper prices, leads to the accumulation of capital in just a few hands. So as larger companies are able to create better and more products at cheaper prices, they end up, say, buying out smaller companies. And this means that capitalism ultimately gets ruled by a small number of giant corporations. A little applicable to the present day, you might think. And finally, still on page 58, he says that society ends up getting divided into two classes: the proprietors, or the capitalists, and the workers, or the laborers. And this increasing divide between the two classes, as we'll see especially when we get to the Communist Manifesto, is what, for Marx, creates the kind of thesis-antithesis structure that will ultimately lead to the collapse of capitalism and to the establishment of a new system, communism. Marx outlines in this text 4 kinds of alienation, which I'm not going to go through in detail here, but I just want to flag because it's essential to this reading, and I really want to talk about it in class discussion. First is the alienation in the object. So the more I externalize my spirit into the vase, but don't get it back in return, the less valuable I become, right? The more kind of used up as a commodity I become, the more dissatisfied I become. The second is alienation in the process, right? The process of production creates a state of misery in the worker because the worker is reduced only to their status as worker. The full spectrum of their humanity is completely irrelevant within the context of the working process. They're forced to be a kind of productive, efficient machine. This leads to the weird phenomenon that Marx describes on page 62, where the worker actually feels most themselves only outside of work. And this is a weird phenomenon for Marx because work is an essential expression of human nature. And so if we're not feeling at ease and happy and affirmed within work, that's a signal that something is wrong. The third kind of alienation Marx details is alienation from species being. As we've said, for Marx, the human species is a species of world builders. We love to create and produce. But capitalist structures of labor alienate us from this because we just start to use work as a means of supporting ourselves in our basic functions. So if you are forced to work for a wage in order to survive, according to Marx, that means that you are not living up to your potential as a member of the species of world builders. What sets us apart from non-human animals for Marx is precisely our ability to create beautiful and useful things according to laws of reason. However, when we lack a true relationship with the products of our labor, we just use our labor as a way to support ourselves in our basic functions, right? We need to have a roof over our heads, we need to eat, etc. We in fact become inferior to non-human animals, because we are sort of extorting ourselves just to survive in our basic animal functions. The fourth kind of alienation is alienation from human to human. By creating a separation between the capitalist class and the worker class, we become pitted against each other as groups. We start to have a division between humans. In addition to that, even within a particular class, if you think about the capitalist class, according to Marx, they're all in competition with each other. And so members of the capitalist class are alienated from each other because they're just each other's rivals. On the workers' side of things, you have a similar phenomenon. The fellow worker is the person for whom I am competing to get a job. Now let's talk about private property. For Marx, private property is the result of alienated labor. So by private property, Marx isn't just talking about something like this vase that I created for myself and I get to enjoy, right? He's talking about a specific form of ownership whereby this is mine and you can't have it. And I probably haven't produced it myself. He says that private property is the exclusion of somebody else's use of a commodity as their own because it belongs to me. He associates the structure of private property with wages, where I get my money for doing certain tasks and that's it. For Marx, the structure of private property indicates that human relations have become mediated through commodities. We need to have things, right? And we need to have things not as objects in their full spectrum of existence, but as commodities, right? Things with exchange value. My sneakers are special to me, not because they help me to get around the city, but because I saved up for them and they're this cool brand and I can post them on my Instagram. Private property, Marx says, reduces our relations to objects to a single kind, that of having. I love the vase when I'm alienated from it because I have it. Right? This is like the Lord of the Rings, my precious type of experience. All of the physical and spiritual senses under capitalism, says, have been reduced to a single sense, the sense of having. So we desire to consume because we have so little means outside of consumption for affirming ourselves, for feeling alive. You might think here about the art world and its commodification. The way that a painting under capitalism is most valuable for how much it gets sold at auction, rather than for the feelings it creates among its viewers. When you go to a museum, you might not even know how to relate to that painting. And so what do? You try and have it, possess it, say by taking a photograph of it or taking a mental image and saying, oh yes, I had that experience of the painting. That is a classic case for Marx of the way that our physical and spiritual senses have been reduced. We want to have things, and when we can't have things, we want to have experiences. We treat everything as a commodity for consumption. Now, this all sounds pretty gloomy, right? And it also sounds like capitalists are just like evil people and we need to overthrow them because they're ruining everything. And that's not the whole story for Marx. Marx actually says on page 74 that there's a necessity to this logic. Capitalism arose as an expression of human existence. And for Marx, it will also fall away as an expression of human existence. Very similar to Hegel's idea of the way that certain formations come into being for a time and then pass away through an internal logic. For Marx, it's the very structure of capitalism, especially the way that it pits labor against capitalists, that leads to a tension that ultimately will become so untenable that capitalism as a structure will just sort of fall away, right? There will be a revolution, in the literal sense of revolution, where it's a revolving or a turning. So things no longer look at all the way they did before. Marx says that the opposition between laborer and capitalist that exists under the capitalist conditions of private property leads to a contradiction. On the side of the laborer, there is all give, give, give. And on the side of the capitalist, there is all take, take, take. But people can only give so much, and people can only take so much. And so this structure gets resolved or negated through an Aufhebung, remember that term from Hegel, through communism. Communism, Marx says on page 69, is the positive expression of private property as overcome. And the word he uses there for overcome is aufgehoben, right? Overcoming through both negating and preserving. But communism just doesn't sort of magically appear. It first has to go through this weird stage that Marx calls here crude communism on page 69. In crude communism, the logic of capitalism reaches its apotheosis. We go from having a division between a class of givers and a class of takers to creating the conditions for all people to be takers. Communism first appears, Marx says, as universal private property with physical possession as its aim. And the logic of capitalism that benefited only certain people gets extended to all people. The irony is that not everybody benefits in this situation. It actually creates intense dissatisfaction because physical possession, of course, is not the ultimate goal of life for Marx. And so crude communism, Marx says, still remains captive to and infected by the logic of private property on page 71. This crude communism will ultimately give way to a truer form of communism, where the objectification of human spirit into things and the subjective affirmation, fulfillment, full spectrum of senses beyond the sheer sense of having will be united and liberated. So communism, according to Marx, wouldn't just mean a different economic system. It would actually mean a different psychology. Humans would have a much broader spectrum of senses. The senses will be humanized. We will be able to enjoy the arts again. Finally, Marx says on page 78 and 79 that communism for him is the next stage of humanity in denying the private property that is characteristic of capitalism. But he avows that it actually can be considered only one stage rather than an end goal, because history is always in the process of becoming, and we can't imagine what will come after the next stage. Consider a common view of human nature: that humans are greedy and have very little regard for how this impacts others. That humans are competitive. That survival of the fittest doesn't just mean adaptation to a given environment, as it does in Darwin, but rather means that some people are better than others, are entitled to more than others, and that they should take what they are entitled to by any means necessary. Such a view of human nature is often used to justify capitalism. But Marx and Engels ask us to consider whether things might be the other way around. What if the idea that humans are greedy and competitive is actually a product of the capitalist structure under which we live, rather than that quote-unquote nature leading to capitalism? This is one of many examples of the way that Marx offers a bottom-up approach. The idea that material conditions provide the possibility for our ways of thinking rather than our ways of thinking leading to material conditions. And Marx and Engels articulate this on page 172, among other places, where they say the selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property. This is a misconception of the ruling class. Ideologies often justify existing features of the status quo, rather than actually reflecting things as they are in nature. And so Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto want to ask us to imagine whether things might be different from this. Let's say a few things about the argument in this text. The first is the division between two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletarians, which we've already been talking about in our reading of Marx as the division between the capitalists and the workers. So the bourgeoisie is the class of modern capitalists who own the means of production, and they are the employers of wage labor. The proletariat is the class of wage laborers. These people sell their labor power, their ability to do work, in order to live, because they don't control the means of production. So they have to sell their labor power to other people because they don't have the means to create objects using their own labor power themselves. Marx and Engels describe, starting on page 163, how capitalism emerges out of feudalism, but comes to constitute its own economic system. So what are some of the features of capitalism at the time that Marx and Engels are writing? Well, first, they say that there's been a simplification of class antagonisms. Rather than a number of competing classes, there are now just two, right? There's been this increasing division. There's the bourgeoisie on the one hand and the proletariat on the other hand. Another feature of modern capitalism in Marx and Engels' time is that industry has established a world market. So think about the fact that Marx and Engels are writing during the Industrial Revolution, when there has been a huge new focus on mass production of goods through factories. There's a bigger import-export trade than before. And so the increasing globalization of trading goods in a capitalist context is something that they also associate with the economic system at their time. Another feature is that the bourgeoisie has finally taken over the state. So there's not a distinction between the owners of the means of production and those governing. Rather, the bourgeoisie has overtaken the state either by installing members of its own within governance and or by basically owning those who govern, by manipulating and controlling them in various manners. The interests of the bourgeoisie come to be the interests that the state is focused on, really. Additionally, traditional class hierarchies have been ruined, as have the relations between humans. Marx and Engels say on page 161 that now humans only relate to each other in terms of self-interest, essentially cash. What can we get out of each other? This has turned personal worth into exchange value, right? Exchange value allows us to judge goods relative to one another, right? How much is this vase worth compared to this other vase? We start to treat people like that. Are you worth more than this other person? In addition, under capitalism, the bourgeoisie starts to exploit the world globally. Think about colonialism, for instance. And the differences in culture and character between different countries or nations dissolve, giving way to a, quote, universal civilized and capitalist type of society. The progressivist view of history becomes this idea that all people have to be alike in order to count as civilized. All nations are compelled to adopt the bourgeois capitalist mode of production. Finally, capitalism in Marx and Engels' time also emphasizes centralization. The separation between the city and the country becomes stronger, with the city growing to have increasingly centralized power. And politics also becomes increasingly centralized as well. Actually, I said finally, but one additional feature of capitalism. Marx and Engels say that the exploitative nature of capitalism was originally veiled by political and religious illusions, but now doesn't even need to hide behind it. Bare exploitation comes to be socially accepted. It's just the way things are. Humans are competitive. They're greedy. If you're exploited, well, maybe you can eventually become the exploiter. Wouldn't that be great? In this text, Marx and Engels describe a gradual process that they are witnessing within capitalism that they think will lead to capitalism's overthrow. And I'm not going to have space here to go through all of those stages, although I look forward to speaking with you about them. But what I want to say here is something about the very broad strokes of what will be, in Marx and Engels' view, a communist revolution. The first is the formation of the proletariat into an actual class. There's this weird paradox whereby even though capitalism separates people into a class of capitalists and a class of proletarians, the proletarians lack what Marx calls class consciousness. They're not aware of the fact that they are all mutually exploited by the same system. And in order to overthrow the exploitative system, they have to band together by realizing that their bonds, their chains are mutually shared. The second is the overthrow of bourgeois supremacy, sometimes known as seizing the means of production. After the proletariat has constituted a class with class consciousness, Marx and Engels think that they need to take over bourgeois supremacy by, say, taking over the means of production. The capitalists may own the means of production, but they actually don't know how to work them in the way that the laborers do, right? It's the laborers who have the material, practical knowledge to create all of the things that the capitalists own. And so actually the proletarians need to recognize not only their shared chains, their shared exploitation, but also their shared power. Once they do that, and Engels think, it will be pretty easy for them to overthrow the capitalists because of this additional power and also because of sheer numbers. There are more proletarians than there are capitalists. Third, what will happen after the overthrow of bourgeois supremacy, Marx and Engels argue, will be the conquest of proletarian political power. They'll go from overthrowing the economic system to actually overtaking the political structure, which is infected, according to Marx and Engels, by bourgeois interests and manipulations. This will be the communist revolution. However, it's not all pretty after this. Marx and Engels are actually pretty pessimistic about the early stages of the communist revolution. They say it will look like despotism. And it will look like despotism because in inverting the ruling system, where the capitalists are on top and the proletarians are on the bottom, we're still going to have a class hierarchy. Suddenly the proletarians will be on top and the capitalists will be on the bottom. The proletarians will take all capital, all accumulated wealth from the bourgeoisie, centralize all instruments of production into the state, right? So further the capitalist project of centralization and increase the total number of productive forces. In doing so, you can see that the initial phases of proletarian rule are actually pretty similar to capitalism. It's just a difference of who's in power, right? There's still accumulation of wealth, there's still centralization, and there's still an increase in productive forces. So in a way, the initial phase of proletarian rule is like an amplified version of capitalism. But eventually, the proletarian rule of political power, Marx and Engels say, will drop away. And there will be an association of free subjects who will no longer even need the centralization in the state. That will be a chance for humans to realize their full expression of human nature as productive creators, because they won't be productively creating for the purpose of accumulating wealth or surviving, but rather because they enjoy it and because they enjoy each other and they enjoy experiencing the full range of human life. I look forward to talking with you about the list of objections to communism that Marx and Engels lay out on pages 170 to 175 and then sort of debunk. Curious what you think about that. For now, I want to close by just asking, returning to the sort of theme of the course overall, what do Marx and Engels trust? Well, they trust the material forces of history that are leading to greater freedom. There's still a logic or reason here, right? Is driving history. In that sense, they trust very similar forces to Hegel. There's still a teleology to history. But for them, unlike for Hegel, the trust should be placed in material conditions themselves rather than the increasing actualization of spirit in material conditions.
Hi, I'm David Peña-Guzmán.
And I'm Ellie Anderson. Welcome to Overthink,
The podcast where two friends
who are also professors
put philosophy in dialogue with the everyday.
Because big ideas are within everyone's reach.
Ellie, a lot of people hate their job. To the point that we have all kinds of ways to talk about how much we hate it based on the day of the week that we are in. So like Wednesdays are hump day, where it's just like, you're making it to the other end of the week. It's downhill from there. Or like TGI Fridays. Thank God it's Fridays, which is also the name of like a chain. Like that's how popular it is.
TGI Fridays is the name of the chain. The phrase is either thank God it's Friday or TGIF. But then Sunday Scaries, right?
Oh, wait, what is that? Sunday Scaries?
Sunday Scaries, that's like the best one. That's when you feel like crap on Sunday because you're like anxious about the Monday you have ahead of you. And then we have Mondays, am I right? For Mondays.
I feel like we really need representation for Tuesdays and Thursdays. Which
Well, Thursdays get Thirsty Thursday, which is like, oh, it's okay to drink if I'm a little hungover on Friday. It doesn't matter so much, right?
And what about Tuesday?
I don't know. What is Tuesday? I actually love a Tuesday, but I also like don't really get Sunday Scaries. So, because usually I don't like teaching. I don't teach on Mondays because I get Sunday Scaries if I teach on Mondays.
Really? Do you really get that?
Yeah.
So I have a friend who gets so anxious on Sundays that he just knows that he won't be able to sleep the whole night on Sundays. Like,
Oh, that sounds absolutely awful.
and like it's not because anything particular is happening on Mondays. Like it's just a regular week, but he just by now has accepted this as part of his reality that on Sundays he's not going to get any sleep out of stress.
Oh my God. And even those who are getting sleep a lot of times aren't looking forward to starting the work day on Monday, right? Like, I think we almost take for granted in our society that most people hate their jobs. or at most like tolerate them, right? And millions of workers in America are actively disengaged in their jobs, sort of using their jobs as a way to like just make enough money to live on or to live comfortably on, right? And maybe like try and check Facebook when they can, be posting on Twitter.
Yeah, or just make it, from one paycheck to the other one. And of course, there is nothing natural about that sentiment. If anything, our collective hatred for our work cultures on the whole is a major indictment of the way in which we've organized our political economy and a
Mm.
sign of just how alienating work is under conditions of capitalism.
Yeah, like what does it say about American ideology that we have this whole narrative around like why work is good for you and you have to do it even though it's not at all fun or fulfilling? Like
Yeah,
that's
well,
a pretty scary picture.
well,
You have to overcome your natural laziness and be of benefit to society.
yeah, I mean, that's what Max Weber calls the Protestant work ethic, that we
Mhm.
moralize work, which is why capitalism and religion are so interconnected in North America and the West, because through work, you not only put food on the table, but you prove that you are a person of good moral standing, right? Because you
Mhm.
suffer through work.
Yes. But you only need that kind of ideology when work for so many people is as painful and as unpleasant as it is.
And it's not to say that work per se is the problem. The problem might be what Karl Marx calls alienation.
Today, we're discussing alienation
Why is work so unfulfilling for so many people?
and to what extent is that due to capitalist modes of production and compensation?
The Marxist concept of alienation has historically been used to make sense of industrial work. But can it also shed light on new, non industrial forms of production?
And can we also describe things outside of work as alienating, such as social media and leisure time? Anytime we work, we are creating something outside of ourselves that reflects back on who we are. And ideally, this reflection gives us some sort of satisfaction. So think about making a shoe. When you make a shoe, you're taking raw materials. Maybe you've got some leather, or ooh, you're making tivas. I'm loving my tivas this summer. You've got some rubber and some fabric and some Velcro. And when I create that shoe, I'm putting my own labor, time, and energy into that. And I am creating the shoe with an aim towards certain ends. I want to make something that I can wear and that hopefully will also be appealing, right? And then when I actually can wear that shoe, I'm enjoying the products of my labor. This is very, very different from the way that most people tend to work in the industrialized and post industrial eras. Instead of making a shoe that I can then enjoy, what I do is I buy a shoe on the market. When I buy a Tiva, I'm buying something that was produced in a factory. And it wasn't produced by just a single cobbler. It may have been produced, for instance, on an assembly line where you've got the base of the shoe that's made out of rubber, and then a machine puts on the top of the shoe. And it probably hasn't been created by just one cobbler. It's likely been produced in a factory by a whole number of people and machines working in tandem, right? It may be
Mhm.
one person's job just to do the stitch on the top of the shoe, stitching the Velcro to the fabric together. This type of work where people are removed from the whole picture and instead are working on an assembly line or working on just one component, repetitive motions over and over again, are a common feature of capitalist societies in the past couple of hundred years. According to Marx, this type of work can't give us the satisfaction that we find in something that we've sort of created on our own and seen out from beginning to end. This type of work is what he would call alienated. Why?
Well, I take it that for Marx, the problem here has to do with our relationship, not just to the product of work, but to the activity of work as well. So for Marx, when we work, it's not just that we put time and energy into our work. We put ourselves into it. Our identity, our very being goes into the kind of activity that we do
Our
because
spirit, if you want to be fancy.
yeah, and he does say that we put our spirit into our work. And that means that when our work expresses who we are and who we take ourselves to be, we find a kind of completion in our work. We feel fulfilled. And yet, as you mentioned, Ellie, under contemporary conditions of production, that kind of cycle can never be completed because of this separation of myself from the work that I do. And this is the difference between alienated and non-alienated labor.
Yeah, and I'd say here that it's not just about a separation of myself from my work, because all products are separated from their producers in a certain way, but it's that the separation is a sort of fragmentation or cut offness, to put it in a
Mhm.
weird way, where, as you mentioned, I can't get that reflection of myself back on myself. The concept of alienation originates in Marx's 1844 manuscripts, which are some of his early work. And he's really working in this text with a picture of human nature where humans are by nature world builders. We seek to externalize our essence by putting it out there in the world and creating things in accordance with a given end, according to laws of beauty and usefulness. But the ability to project ourselves outside of ourselves through work is a beautiful part of what it means to be human, according to Marx.
Yeah, and I think this is an important point to stress because a lot of people who are not particularly familiar with the ins and outs of Marxist theory often believe that communists believe that work is bad, that work is not good. And Marx is actually of the exact opposite opinion. He believes that it is through work that we achieve our human nature, what he sometimes calls our species being. It is through
Mhm.
work that we build a world with others in solidarity, which is very much in the spirit of communism, right? Building a world together in which we are collectively free. And so the point is not so much to get away from work, but to work in such a way that we achieve that world building function that, as you say, is cut off under conditions of
Mhm.
capital.
Yeah, and I think we can return later to what it looks like to have non-alienating work.
Mhm.
For now, let's talk more specifically about what alienation looks like. According to Marx, alienation has four different manifestations. So let's talk a little bit about these four manifestations of alienation. And if you can't keep track of them as we talk about them, it's not the end of the world. They're really different sides of the same phenomenon. Alienation in the product, alienation in the activity, alienation from species being, and alienation from other people.
So, Ellie, let's begin with the first one. How do you think about alienation from the product?
Alienation from the product is basically the fact that when I'm working at the Tiva factory using a sewing machine to sew the Velcro strip onto the fabric and doing that over and over and over again throughout my day, I have no investment in the actual product. For one, I'm not using it myself, right? Once I'm done sewing the Velcro strip on, I start sewing the Velcro strip onto another Tiva, and all of the products are totally replaceable to me. And I have no commitment to them because I'm not going to end up wearing them or seeing other people who wear them. And in addition to that, I lack a sense of the creative whole and the use value of the Tiva itself. I'm putting my time and energy into creating something that is unable to give me recognition of my essence back because it belongs to somebody else, right? I
Mhm.
don't ever even own the Tiva that I have. I am being paid on an hourly basis to create something that belongs to the owner of the Tiva factory, who then will sell it wholesale, et cetera, et cetera. It goes through this long process of changing hands, and those hands are not mine.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to recognize that for Marx, a big part of the problem here, in terms of thinking about our alienation from the products that we create, is precisely that most workers, and of course, he's writing in the context of the late 19th century, so he's thinking about industrial work. Most workers are wage laborers, which means
Mhm.
that the relationship they have to their bosses is a relationship in which they don't own anything that they produce. Rather, they make an agreement or a contract with an employer to sell their time in exchange for a specific wage. And it's that dynamic that, according to Marx, is the condition for the possibility of this kind of alienation. It's because of that
Yeah.
I don't own the thing that I produce because I'm basically selling my time rather than working on something that is mine.
Yeah, Marx thinks that wage labor is inherently alienating because money is a sorry substitute for a connection to your actual creation.
Well, and because there's a major gap, right, between the amount of money that I get paid to work those 8 hours a day and the amount of value that my work actually produces for the boss, right? This is where exploitation kicks in because I bring in more money than I'm actually paid.
Yeah, and in this process, Marx says, as a worker, become enslaved to the product that I produce because the product allows me to exist. I get wages for producing the product. And only in so doing am I able to survive. And so basically, what happens is this weird feedback loop where the more time and energy I put into the product, the more hold the product has over me. I'm losing my power through this relation.
Yeah, and Marx calls this objectification, where the product becomes this external object that is way bigger than me and that I no longer control. And so it becomes this mysterious force. He uses that language. And so I'm basically at its mercy rather than the other way around.
Mhm.
Now, the second form of alienation that Marx talks about in the 1844 manuscripts is alienation from the activity of work or from the means of production. So let's assume that I work in a Tiva factory. By the way, I don't even know what a Tiva is, so let's just bracket that for this whole episode and move on.
It's a sandal. It's a sandal that's like it's like a nerdy sandal. You've definitely seen them. It's like a Birkenstock. The Tiva reference is totally going to date us because they're like cool again in 2021 and they're going to be very out again in a few years.
Oh, well, they will date you because I don't even know what they are. So the second kind of alienation has to do with the means of production and the activity of working. So when I work at the Tiva factory, Marx says, on top of not owning the very Tivas that I create with my hands, I don't own any of the means through which I work. So to create a Tiva, maybe I need a sewing machine or a hammer or some kind of machine for creating the sole or the straps or the Velcro. All of that, the entire factory, of course, is owned by a rich person who pays me to work for them. But it means that even the activity itself no longer feels mine. So the activity itself is alien. It's something that stands out over and against me in a way.
Mhm. Yeah, and Marx talks about this as sort of deadening the creative faculties. Like
Yes.
I'm just there basically as a machine to help the job get done. And because I'm sort of enslaved to the object and enslaved to the employer, I really am just like losing my soul through
Mhm.
this. Marx writes, the worker is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. So think about the worker who is just like miserable at work all day and is just thinking about what happens when she comes home from work. It's like time to actually be on her own, to have dinner, to watch some Netflix. Like also kind of sad, that her leisure time is just reduced for so many people to a means of recovery from the alienating conditions of work.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question that I want us to return to later, which is that for Marx, leisure time is in many ways a pristine state that is free of the alienation brought about by the activity of working in a factory. I don't know to what extent that still holds true, but we'll talk about that. The point here being that the act of working is no longer enriching. It's no longer something that makes me feel like I am able to put my signature on the world, that I can put part of my being or my spirit out there in order to feel at one with the world. Like the world reflects me and I reflect the world. That kind of loop again is interrupted by the
Yeah.
organization of labor.
Yeah, and I think that leads us into the third manifestation of alienation, which is alienation from species being, which,
Mhm.
as you said, is just like such a great phrase. Species being is basically human nature or human essence for Marx, although I think species being is a better term for it because you avoid the presumptions of nature or essence that imply that there's like a fixed idea of what the human is at all times, right? Marx is very much one of these thinkers who thinks that humans are a sort of a historical idea developing over time. And so it makes more sense to talk about our being or our condition than it does about our essence or nature. In any case, our species being is to be active humans who create. Homo faber. We are the kind of beings who make things. And specifically, we make things by transforming nature. Humans, according to Marx, are the only creatures who are able to orient ourselves within our world, understanding it and the way it works. According to Marx, humans have freedom. In comparison with non-human animals, we are able to stand apart from nature, recognize ourselves as part of that whole, and to produce our own creations according to the laws of beauty. But what happens in alienated labor is that we actually not only lose our human capacities by virtue of not being free or able to realize ourselves through creative activity, we in fact become inferior to non-human animals, he says. And I know, David, as somebody who works on animal cognition, you're probably like, wee, what are these humanistic assumptions here? I think this is maybe the aspect of alienation that sort of like rubs post-humanist thinkers the wrong way. But according to Marx, the bottom line here is really that alienated labor reduces us to the kinds of beings who are able to meet our animal needs. We're able to feed ourselves, shelter ourselves, and perform our basic bodily functions thanks to the wages we receive from wage labor. But this actually means that our species life becomes a way of supporting us as animals, and we're even less free than animals.
And I think the concept of our species being is one of the trickier concepts in Marx. And I like the way in which you define it, which is in terms of our freedom, our world building activity, and our understanding of laws of beauty, which allow us to create beautiful things, beautiful buildings, beautiful social relations, beautiful works of art. Now, to those three categories, freedom, work, and beauty, I think we can add a fourth one, which is our awareness of death. Because one of the things that, according to Marx, makes the demand to create a world with others so pressing is our implicit understanding of our own finitude. The fact that we have one shot at this, we're going to die. And that means that in the time that we have in this world, we ought to aspire to building a world in which we can be free with others. And this is what would make Marx essentially an existentialist.
Yeah, although Marx would hate being called an existentialist, which was a term not coined until well after his death. But it has connotations of like subjective freedom as opposed to structural conditions.
So I don't think he would hate it as much as just be confused by it. But yes, point well taken.
Okay, tell us about the fourth type.
Now, the fourth type of alienation is, for me, the most important, which is our social alienation. That is to say, our alienation from other people. In a society that is dominated by a combination of wage labor and private property, Marx says, people no longer relate to one another as comrades who are capable of working together to build a communal world. Rather, we only relate to one another as members of our specific class. One of the problems for Marx is that capitalism creates an asymmetrical distribution of wealth, where those who own the means of production start accumulating more and more and more wealth because, as I mentioned before, there is a major discrepancy between what they pay me and the amount of money that I actually produce from them. And this imbalance just starts becoming a self-reinforcing loop. The more money they make, the more they can actually oppress their workers. And so for Marx, it means that society over time is split into two camps, which he calls the bourgeoisie, the haves, and the proletariat, the have-nots.
And the proletariat is made up of wage laborers.
Exactly. And so in capitalism, I no longer relate to other people as people that I might engage in all kinds of meaningful projects with. I simply relate to them in their capacity as representatives of a particular class. I relate to you either as a fellow worker, if you are another person trapped in wage labor, or I relate to you as a boss, as a rich person that in theory could help me feed myself by buying out my labor time. We only relate to each other through our class identity.
Yeah, and what this really prevents is the possibility for solidarity. On the one hand, prevents solidarity between classes, right? Because if I am a wage laborer, I'm driven to be hostile towards the owners of the means of production. And conversely, if I'm an owner of the means of production, I'm going to be hostile towards the wage laborer because I want to pay them as little as possible in order to make me as much money as I can get. But then there's also a lack of solidarity between the workers and between the owners of the means of production, right? They're not really meeting on common ground either.
Yeah, and the reason here is because across classes, our interests are pitted against one another, as you point out. But internal to the particular class that he calls the proletariat, it means that I see other people with whom, in theory, I could develop solidarity because we're both oppressed by the economic system as competitors because we're competing for those scraps that are handed to us by the owners of the means of production. And so, unfortunately, instead of joining hands with other workers, what happens is that I simply enter into competition with others. I only see them as people who, in theory, could get my job if I don't get it first from them.
Absolutely. We're all sort of these replaceable units who are just like retreating at the end of the day into our own private homes, but in the public sphere are in competition with one another. And I mean, this is like a really sad picture of human existence and one that I think is evident in a lot of ways in our culture. Like the idea that vegging out is what we need to do at the end of a long day, or the idea that you're always going to be sort of manipulating behind a coworker's back to try and be the one who gets a promotion.
Yeah, and I think those examples might show the continued relevance of the Marxist concept of alienation today. In the 180 years since Marx penned his 1844 manuscripts, where he introduces the theory of alienation, a number of things have changed in our political economy. We have new forms of post industrial labor. So think about things like cognitive labor or the service industry or even the gig economy. Think about your
Mhm.
Uber drivers, your Lyft drivers.
Yeah, it's like, is a TikTok influencer alienated,
Yeah.
right? Or, even though we still have the Tiva factories and all kinds of other literal factories, we also have the rise of like the IT department.
Mhm.
How do we talk about alienation in the product with somebody who is a marketing specialist?
This raises the question of the extent to which Marx's concept of alienation still applies in our present reality, or whether we
Yeah.
need a new term to really name the experience of workers under these new conditions and in these new markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the concept of alienation has really fallen out of fashion in recent decades in social critique. And then now it's seeing a resurgence, thanks in part to the work of German philosopher Rahel Jaegi, who wrote a book called Alienation that has made waves in the past few years. And I think here, like, the question is in part, to what extent does the notion of alienation presume some sort of utopian, idyllic state of non alienation where humans are living out their full expression of who they truly can be? Like that picture of the utopian expression of human nature, I think is really far removed from the cynicism and postmodern tendencies of philosophy in recent decades.
Well, and another reason why it's fallen out of fashion has to do with the fact that a number of philosophers have made critiques of alienation as a concept. So, for example, I'm here thinking about the work of the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, who is by far the most famous French Marxist of the 20th century. And his critique is very technical, and we don't need to jump into the details, but he makes the claim that the Marxist concept of alienation really is not the best in Marxist repertoire of conceptual tools for thinking about capitalism, because the concept of alienation focuses on the experience of a subject, right? Like, I feel alienated because of the particular kind of job that I have. And Althusser made an argument that became quite influential in Marxist theory and political philosophy, which is that we should not be thinking about capitalism in terms of subjective experience. We rather ought to think about it in terms of structural social relations. And so that
Mhm.
critique really pushed the concept of alienation onto the back burner, and a number of very influential Marxist philosophers started moving away from it. And so I think you're right, Ellie, that
Alienation out.
yeah, like we've alienated ourselves from the Marxist concept of alienation. But as you say, it seems like there's a resurgence of interest in this concept as we're coming to the realization that we need to theorize that lived experience of
Mm-hmm.
workers who are performing new kinds of labor, but whose labor may nonetheless lead to some recognizable forms of alienation.
Yeah, definitely. It's like, even if the IT worker who feels disengaged for most hours of the day doesn't fit the exact picture of Marx's original concept of wage labor under capitalism, when they report having an extreme malaise, feeling only at home outside of work, feeling disconnected from the fruits of their labor, or feeling like there aren't even any fruits of labor, how do we explain that? And something that's interesting to think about here is the phenomenon that anthropologist David Graeber calls bullshit jobs, which are
Yeah.
basically jobs that like don't really add any value to the world. Graeber says, "Hey, capitalism has gotten to the point where most of us could probably work far fewer hours and still have the economy tick along." And yet, that's not the case. Americans are working longer and harder than ever. Why is that? What are we doing then with our time? And he says, like, actually, what a lot of us are doing with our time is basically nothing. There are so many jobs, many of which are precisely in these new forms of the economy, like the service sector, that don't really add any value to the world and that also don't actually do anything for the company or the laborer. And interestingly, to your point about subjective experience, David, you mentioned that it had really fallen out of fashion with the Althusserian approach. And what David Graeber says is actually one of the ways that we can define a bullshit job is based on the subjective experience of the worker. If the
Hmm.
worker thinks that their job doesn't add any value to the world and they feel crappy about themselves and about their job, then it's very likely that they are working in a bullshit job. So that's actually the main criterion of a
Of a
bullshit job
bullshit
is
job.
feeling
Yeah.
like your job is bullshit.
Well, and what Graeber calls bullshit jobs, the philosopher Emmanuel Renaud calls post-Fordist jobs. In Renaud's account, the transition from Fordism to post-Fordism amounts to the following. With the rise of the Ford assembly line, there emerged a new model of the worker that differs in significant ways from the classical industrial wage laborer that Marx had in mind in the 19th century. So, what defines the Fordist worker is that even though they are wage laborers, they make relatively high wages. So think about 1950s, middle of
Mm-hmm.
the century, American dream kind of blue collar work. You work hard, you make enough money to buy the very products that you produce. And so this new model of the worker is working in a factory, but making a lot more money. Now, in our post Fordist reality, Renaud says, we've moved away from that American ideal. Now, what we have are, again, these bullshit jobs, which are defined by things like short term employment contracts, right? Like, think about the independent contractor. That's a post
Mm-hmm.
Fordist job. Um,
Been there.
they are defined by an extreme lack of security when it comes to things like health insurance or other forms of protection. So think about, for example, in academia, something like the figure of the adjunct that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
receive the same protection as tenure
Also
track,
been there.
as tenure track faculty. And even though post Fordism is incomparable either to Fordism in the middle of the century or to political economy in the 19th century, Renaud says it's still producing new types of work that are alienated and new forms of exclusion, like the
Yeah.
perpetually unemployed class. There are now people who are perpetually unemployed, which in the past was not the case. Things went more in like a cycle of like a bust and boom. But
Mm-hmm.
all these jobs that no longer had the protections that Fordism afforded, or even that industrial 19th century work afforded, are the defining feature of our reality.
Yeah, I think that's interesting though, because it sounds to me like what Renaud is talking about is actually really different from what David Graeber is talking about with bullshit jobs, because bullshit jobs, according to Graeber, are actually usually white collar, relatively well paid, and almost like too secure. Like
Hmm.
you have a job where basically your job is securing rooms for all of the CEOs to have meetings in a building that the company already has. And the CEOs could easily reserve those rooms for themselves, but they just don't. And so, like, your job can be done in an hour and it's something somebody else could do, as opposed to an adjunct faculty member, which I know from experience is not at all a bullshit job. Like, teaching as Graeber talks about it, is like one of the least bullshit jobs possible because it produces an extraordinary amount of value for students and for the world. So I would say, like, in my experience as an adjunct faculty member, that is really alienating because you don't know if you're going to have employment past the current academic year.
Right.
You have virtually
Right.
no buy-in to the university because you're not compensated for going to faculty meetings. You're also not compensated for doing your research, right? And so, like, you have very little buy-in to the general scholarly university ideal that you went to
Mhm.
grad school for. And you also find yourself antagonistically related to other faculty members because you're jealous of the people who are on the tenure track. Now I'm one of them. And you find yourself at odds with administrators because you're just begging for scraps. And you even find yourself at odds with the students because all you want from them is positive evaluations so you can stay on
That's
for
right.
another semester. The alienation of bullshit jobs seems more to me to be related to a general sense of meaninglessness, that alienation from the activity and from the product, because you're not actually producing anything tangible and you feel like you have very little control over your life.
So if the dominant category in Graeber's analysis is meaninglessness, then yes, I can see why there would be a significant difference here, because the dominant category in Renault's account is insecurity. And that
Ah,
insecurity can be either material, again, with these short-term contracts where there's no banister for the worker, or it can be psychological insecurity. So one of the examples that he gives of a modern alienated form of labor is the position of the salaried professional who, again, makes a lot of money in comparison to somebody working a minimum wage job. But Renault says the salaried position does something that you and I, Ellie, have talked about in our previous episode about capitalism and temporality, which is that it
mm-hmm.
denies the worker the security of knowing that they can clock out, that they can leave the work
Mm.
behind and recede into that space that Marx really idealized, which is leisure time. And so you might be in a salaried position, you might be making 100,000 a year and be really happy about that. For Renault, it doesn't follow that you are not alienated.
Oh, yeah. I thought you said that salaried workers were non-alienated in Renault's view.
No, no, no. These are all alienated modern workers. It's just that
Mhm,
the
mhm.
alienation is not necessarily the same because the
Yeah.
source of the insecurity is different. So your insecurity might be, again, material, contractual, economic, or it might be psychological, sort of
Uh-huh.
not having the ability to step away from work.
I see. Yeah, because, like, as an adjunct faculty member, I at least had a lot of flexibility over how I spent my day, whereas the person who has to sit in their office from 9 AM to 6 PM and has maybe a pretty high salary and a lot of security from a financial standpoint feels just completely imprisoned by their office. What do you think about the idea that technology might be further alienating us from our lives, whether it's work or actually, like, even things outside of work?
Yeah, so this raises a question about whether alienation applies only to work. And there are all kinds of positions here. So, for example, Marx again makes the claim that you're only alienated when you're working, and not just when you're working any kind of work, when you're working wage labor. Other
Yeah.
people have made the argument that all labor that is productive and economic is alienated. So, for example, the German philosopher Herbert Marcuse makes that claim. He says, as long as you're working, even if it's not wage labor, there's alienation. So it kind of expands the critique. Now, the contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul Han makes the argument that it's not even just work, whether wage or non-wage, but even our leisure time has become alienated because precisely our reliance on technology. So he writes a lot about the attention economy and the way in which technologies like the iPhone, for example, or social media are having their tentacles reach deeper and deeper into our social life outside of work, that we're starting to see the reproduction of something akin to Marxist alienation in non-work settings. So think about something like
Yeah.
information exposure fatigue, where you just like are constantly bombarded by notifications because of social media and the iPhone, that you become alienated even from your leisure time.
Oh my God. This is reminding me of when I had a short-lived blog in grad school and I wrote a post about how Instagram is a version of alienated labor because it's encouraging us to externalize ourselves, but then Instagram more or less owns the product. And there was some debate at the time about whether Instagram did actually own your photos or not. But even if they are technically your property, I think you could still argue that an Instagram post is a version of alienation. You're not getting that like reciprocal reflection of the full picture of your humanity back.
I get that when I post a selfie. Just my humanity, here it is.
This is my creation according to the laws of beauty.
Yeah, and the French philosopher Guy Debord has made precisely this argument in his book Society of the Spectacle, where he says, again, even that time that we spend by ourselves, having fun, looking for entertainment as a way of enriching our lives, is now itself a tool of capitalism and therefore a source of alienation.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about something like the trip that you look forward to for such a long time that you put a bunch of your wages toward. And then when you actually go on it, all you're doing is like taking pictures. So you will remember it after the fact. I think travel is very alienated in the way that we currently experience it. And your experience is overdetermined by like, the Instagram posts that you've saved of the places you want to go and the blogs that you've read about where you should go and your Airbnb reviews that have led you to pick a particular place. And so it's not alienation, in the sense that Marx is talking about it by getting wages in return for something you're producing. But I do think it's alienated in the sense that it is a kind of deficient mode of relation to self and world where we're not getting a kind of satisfaction in the true sense because we're always looking through the lens of the other, whether it's the Instagram post or the blog or the after the fact reflection on, oh, when I will have been on this vacation, as opposed to I'm on this vacation now.
Yeah, and I think we could very directly use the four categories of alienation that Marx talks about in the 1844 manuscripts and sort of apply them to a lot of contemporary phenomena. So think about the way in which social media, which I really detest, yet participate in,
minimally.
the way in which it separates us from others because we no longer relate to our friends or our followers really as people, but merely in their capacity as possible like givers, right? So like it creates also a kind of competition amongst people in our social circles for attention, for likes, for comments, and so on and so forth. And so it really splits us up in a way that I would say prevents the development of a modern form of class consciousness, which for Marx is the key to the communist revolution that will ultimately result in the abolishment of wage labor and private property and the creation of a free world.
Enjoying this episode? Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also connect with us and other listeners on Facebook and Instagram.
So, David, this conversation is making me want to play a game that I'm going to call Alienated or Not. So, Etsy shop owner, alienated or not alienated? I had a student write an essay about this, and I'm really curious what you think.
Spoiler alert, my answer will always be alienated because I don't think there's a lot of non-alienated work in our society. But like, wait, what was the specific example that you asked me?
Etsy shop owner. You make jewelry and you sell it to people yourself using the app or website Etsy. You get to set the price, you get to set the terms of your labor, and all you have to do is send it in a package and the person receives it and writes you a 5-star review.
Okay, so definitely an interesting category. I would want to know whether Etsy sellers, for example, pay a fee to the website.
Ooh, that's a good question. Okay, hold on. I'm Googling it. Yes, there are 3 basic selling fees: a listing fee, a transaction fee, and a payment processing fee.
You see, and so there is an element of alienation there. But I also wonder how Etsy sellers relate to one another, because that would give us an insight into the question of species being and solidarity, how they relate to one another. Do they see each other as like, hey, let's unite forces as a way of improving our lot? Or is it a really competitive space? I'm just not familiar enough with it.
Well, it's certainly got to be competitive in the sense that you are competing for additional buyers over other people, and you're competing for reviews. So the success of Etsy shops depends heavily on how many five-star reviews you have, and also just like how many reviews you have, right? And so that's a way that Etsy sellers are in competition with each other for sure. And they're also treating their sellers as potential reviewers, which I think is probably alienating as
Hmm.
well. If you get a nice handwritten note from an Etsy shop when you buy a piece of their jewelry, it's probably because they want a five-star review.
Yeah, so if you have to like do like behind the scene deals where it's like I'll give you a 5-star review and you give me a 5-star review. Yeah, so I would say Etsy sellers alienated.
Okay, my turn.
So let me think. What about artists? I'm here thinking about a poet, an independent artist who does poetry and writes it and tries to publish it in various magazines, who then pay him
Mhm.
or her for that work. And he or she
Or
tries
them.
to live off of that.
Yes. So, on the one hand, the poet is creating something according to their own plan, right? And also according to their own sort of like creative drives, which may or may not, be articulated under a plan. In that sense, you might say that they're not alienated from the process. All they need is a pen and paper, which they own. They own the means of production. But they definitely are alienated from the product if they're trying to publish it and sell it, because they will sell it for a price to a particular zine or journal or whatever it is, collection.
Well, I agree with you that my first intuition would be to say that they are alienated from their work because they have to sell it, especially if they have to give up copyrights to the publisher, which is what you and I have to do with all our articles. We basically give them away to these large corporations.
Mhm.
But I don't know about the process of production, the means of production. And the reason that that's more complicated for me is that I wonder whether a poet, in order to sell their poetry or get it placed in the right magazines, actually has to abide by whatever conventions dominate the present moment.
Yeah.
So, like, if like absurdist poetry is in and that's what the readers of the magazines are demanding, it seems like that person is having their arm twisted in an indirect
Yeah.
way. So even
Mhm.
though it's poetry, even though it's art, even though it's creative, I'm not sure that there is no alienation of some sort from the means of production, even though it's kind of organic and spontaneous.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm also thinking about the way that, when we think about alienation from species being an alienation from other people, we might say that the poet is, if they want to be successful, likely to be alienated in the sense that they have to create themselves as a product of human capital. They have to have a particular brand. I do know people who have made writing careers out of having a large presence on Twitter or some other form of social media. It's kind of a prerequisite these days to be successful in some sectors of publishing, which is just really scary to me for so many reasons. But so that also shows that it's like you're not just purely expressing your species being and connecting with other humans through writing poetry. You are crafting yourself as a brand. Like you might think about Rupi Kaur, the kind of millennial poet whose works were all over Urban Outfitters. It's
Mhm.
like really banal poetry, but Rupi Kaur is like a kind of force. She's
Mm.
one of the most famous poets, I think, of our generation.
Well, and anybody who's a freelance writer will tell you making a living out of writing these days is a grind. It's a battle, not
Mhm.
only because the market is so swamped, but because publications are dying, especially literary publications. And so I think that has to figure into our account of whether it's a kind of alienated or non alienated labor. Like the material
Yeah.
realities matter.
Yeah. Jeff Bezos, alienated or not.
Well, I think we might want to say yes, but I have heard the argument that celebrities embody non alienated labor. And that, yeah,
What?
because they live really well, all their needs are met. And in many ways, they experience the world as a reflection of them, right? Like, not a lot of worries.
But not being worried and having your needs met does not mean you're not
Oh,
alienated.
I don't agree with that interpretation of celebrity cultures. The last thing I want to do is say that the goal of a Marxist revolution would be to turn everybody into like a modern day celebrity. Especially because I do think the social concept of alienation or alienation from others is the most important. And I don't
Yeah.
think anybody clears that bar in the status
Celebrities
quo.
are very cut off from the
Oh,
world.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm here thinking about some of the testimonies of like big stars who say, I literally can't go out because
Yeah.
everybody only relates to me as a star. They just want my selfie. I cannot interact with others meaningfully. So they are alienated in a social way as well. They are reduced to an aspect of their personality.
Wait, but what about Bezos? Because
Bezos,
Bezos isn't just a celebrity, right? He's like a multi-billionaire, soon to be trillionaire.
yeah, Bezos is alienation itself.
Bezos is the devolution of species being.
He
No longer world builders, just pure machines of greed.
Yeah, as opposed to species being, he's just individual being. He is the person who is for himself and for himself alone.
That's so generous. I'm going to say he's individual non-being. Although that would be so much more convenient if he were non-being, then he wouldn't be like ruining the world.
So definitely Bezos is out.
So we should not end our episode with Jeff Bezos. Let's say something briefly about what a future of non-alienation might look like. So David, you and I have had a hard time coming up with an example of non-alienated labor in the current moment. Although we didn't talk about people who live off the land in like a commune. Maybe we should have addressed that. But in any case, we're almost out of time. And so we can leave that to our listeners to decide whether alienation would or would not still be present there within the backdrop of a globalized capitalist world. But in Marx's account, capitalism is an alienating economic structure, and we're never going to find non-alienated work within capitalism, which is why he proposes communism. And as you said, David, that still would involve work, but it would involve a kind of work that allows us to find an actual reflection of your human being in your work. Maybe we can just think about one proposal in the contemporary world for non-alienated labor. Any candidates come to mind, David?
Well, it's not a candidate for non-alienated labor, but it is a candidate for non-alienation. And that, for me, is universal basic income. This notion that people should be able to have an income independently of whether or not they work out of need. And so it liberates individuals from the need to work so that they embark on those projects that are actually meaningful for them. So if I am the kind of person, for example, that loves to bake, then I can start a bakery, not because I need to make ends meet, but because I really want to put myself into my work. I want to do something that represents me well, that I feel proud of, and that I know other people will love. And so I become a baker. And I think universal basic income is our best contemporary shot at beginning to create a world that is not alienated in a Marxist sense.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that more to decide strongly either way. But I do think at the very least that the problem with wage labor for Marx is, at least in part, our dependency on wage labor for meeting our basic needs of survival. And that certainly would be remedied with universal basic income.
Yeah, and so I don't see what form of alienation wouldn't be solved by universal basic income if UBI was truly universally implemented, because it does liberate us from the need to sell our time in exchange for money.
Well, I think my only concern would be that UBI is a way for kind of offering a baseline of equality, but it doesn't imply that people wouldn't also supplement their UBI with other forms of wage labor.
Yes.
So there would still be potential inequality, potential reliance on wage labor, potential competition. Andrew Yang is like not a communist hero.
Yeah, of course. And so you're exactly right on this response, Ellie. And maybe we would want to change it to a universal equal income where just everybody makes the same amount of money, period. Of course, that's still a second best in comparison to what Marx proposes, which is a wholesale revolution where the proletariat takes up arms, takes control of the means of production, and establishes a new social order that doesn't have these fundamental inequalities. But what I like about UBI, or universal equal income, is that 10 years ago, it was nowhere in the horizon in our political discussions. And suddenly it is, right? With pilot programs starting in various places, like in Canada, parts of Europe, even in California. And so it seems like a practical, plausible approach that holds a lot of promise.
Especially because we're moving away now from this, I think, very toxic pseudo-social Darwinist mentality that if we didn't have to work for our wages and subsistence, we would all be lazy and never get anything done. A lot of humans enjoy productive activity.
Yeah, and that's why whenever I teach Marx to my students, I really drive home the point that for Marx, the problem is not labor, because labor is, in fact, the answer. It is through work that we build a better world.
Okay, let's get back to work then.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
You can find us at overthinkpodcast.com, where you can email us with questions, feedback, or even requests for life advice.
You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter at overthink_pod. We want to thank our audio editor, Ross Harris, and our production assistants, Sam Hernandez and Loki Ho.
Thanks to Samuel P.K. Smith for the original music and Trevor Ames for our logo. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, I'm Ellie Anderson,
And I'm David Peña-Guzmán. Welcome to Overthink,
the podcast where two friends
who are also professors,
put philosophy in dialogue with the everyday.
because big ideas are within everyone's reach. Today, we'll be talking about how we experience time under late capitalism.
Not sure what late capitalism is? Or even what capitalism is?
Well, you will by the end of this episode.
We'll also discuss the way that capitalism alienates us from our experience of time, replacing lived time with clock time.
By way of conclusion, we'll talk about some of the ways the current pandemic has altered our experience of time and has enabled some new possibilities.
There could be a silver lining to all of this bullshit. So David, when I think about how I experience time, I'm thinking about my calendar. I think about a day as a blank page with different chunks of time, different colors maybe. 10:30 to 11:30, I've got a meeting. 11:30 to 12:30, I'm checking emails and responding to them. 12:30 to 1:30 is lunch, and so on and so forth. What about you?
Well, I also think about the cyclical aspect of time. So I think in terms of the week, the thing that I have to look forward to, Fridays, or the thing that I don't look forward to, Mondays. Because I am an academic, I think about the academic cycle. So I also think in terms of these larger blocks of time, like what I have to do every week and what I have to do every month.
I almost think about a wheel chopped up into quarters depending on the season when I picture a year.
Yeah, and like the clock that is on the wall, it sort of moves at regular intervals. It just spins on its axis. So there is this cyclicality to time, but there are also these units that mark the movement of time that are always the same length or the same chunk.
Yeah, and we need that in order to be able to connect with each other. If I say, let's meet at 10:30, I need to know that your 10:30 is my 10:30 so we don't run into any issues.
Yes, and the thing about this seemingly natural, obvious experience of time is that it does seem to be a historically novel creation, one that is associated with the rise of capitalism since the 17th and 18th centuries. And so what we'll do today is think about the ways in which our experience of time that we typically don't really think much about is shaped and molded and conditioned by capitalism itself.
So one thing I think we often take for granted is the very presence of clocks and other objective markers of time in the way that you were talking about. In fact, the rise of standard clocks is relatively recent and does coincide with the rise of capitalism. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of folks in Europe had access to personal watches, and that was sort of a status symbol. The historian Edward Thompson talks about the rise of personal timekeeping pieces in relation to the sort of universal objective standards that we need from a large-scale capitalist society. And if personal timekeeping pieces are on the rise in the Industrial Revolution, so that's sort of early to mid 19th century, the turn of the 20th century brings about an even more radical revolution in our concept of time. And this is through the rise of the telegraph and the way that the telegraph helped establish railway time. Suddenly, across an entire country, you get a standard time. You get the adoption of Greenwich Mean Time, which establishes a standard clock time around the entire world. So suddenly, I mean, you're in Paris right now, David. I'm in Los Angeles. We're 9 hours apart. We were able to arrange a meeting together because we share this sense of objective time.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Greenwich time because, especially in relation to us, it seems like time under capitalism really usurps the time previously played by space. So in the old days, we might say we are so many hundreds of kilometers away from one another. But now when I think about you, I think of Ellie as 9 hours before me. And so there's
Totally.
that sense in which our understanding of distance, of geography, of territory is all thoroughly temporal because time has become the defining characteristic of experience under capitalism.
And there's also a shift here from qualitative ways of experiencing time to quantitative ones. Thompson talks about the shift from task-oriented time to labor time. We'll say a little bit more in a bit about what labor time looks like and what that means. But one thing that he notes is examples of non-capitalist cultures that use measurements of time such as how long it takes to cook an egg.
Or how long it takes to say an Ave Maria in Latin America. He talks about how in the 17th century, for example, people measured time and talked about time in terms of, oh, I'll see you in 7 Ave Marias, which are prayer units.
And that is just so different from the way that we think about time today, which is completely devoid of those qualitative markers of content. It's empty time.
One of the things that Thompson argues that is particularly important for our episode in thinking about the temporality of late capitalism is that the temporality of capitalism in general really replaced a pre-capitalist temporality that we find in the 16th and 15th century and even before in the medieval period that was defined first and foremost by a rootedness in nature. So if you think about how people before the rise of capitalism organized their lives, it really was around the day-night cycle. It was around the natural flow of the seasons. It was around agricultural tasks. When do you plant? When do you harvest? And starting in the 17th century, you have this transformation to an abstract time. We can call it a Newtonian time because all the units are interchangeable in a mechanical way. And that's really what opens up a new horizon, which is the horizon that we find ourselves in.
In non-capitalist and or pre-capitalist societies, the ways of marking time are just so different from what we take for granted today. So for instance, in medieval Europe, the main demarcation of time for a community was the ringing of the bells in the church. But then there are also these other markers that you mentioned, the markers of the seasons, the sort of lived subjective feel of when the weather is starting to get cooler, that are much more important than the overdetermination by the calendar that we have today. So of course, calendars existed in medieval Europe, but they had less of an impact on the sort of lived subjective experience of individuals simply by virtue of the fact that individuals did not have as much access to external markers of time. They couldn't check their phone at any particular moment. If they had a calendar at home, hopefully it would correspond with the calendars that other folks had and they'd be on the same page about the same date. But with a phone, I can literally check absolutely immediately and I can communicate that to others. I can say, hey, David, I think my phone is messing up. It says that it's September 15th, but it's actually October, right? And you're able to verify that for me. There were fewer modes of external verification.
Well, and what we have to think about here, and this is sort of an insight from the history of science, is that today we are used to thinking about calendar time and clock time as unproblematic and entirely reliable, but that was not always the case. So when we think about the time before the scientific revolution in the 17th century, there really was a problem in Europe about the reliability of the calendar because we didn't have all the data about the place of the Earth in the solar system and the relationship between the solar cycle and the lunar cycle. And so the calendars that were created were always in an increasing state of crisis where slowly they were sort of getting out of joint with reality. And so whereas today we think of time as something that we've mastered, at least from an abstract point of view, in the 15th, 16th century and before, calendar time was actually much less reliable than the natural indicators of time. The rooster, for example, cock-a-doodle doing at 6 in the morning is a much more reliable and consistent indicator than a calendar that is, again, always in a state of crisis.
Yeah, it's almost as if calendar time is no longer a problem for us. So we are out of joint with natural rhythms, but completely in line with calendar time. And it sounds like what you're describing, David, is maybe that it was the inverse in previous periods.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's fair to say that before the rise of mercantilism and then capitalism as we understand it today, people found natural rhythms of time, the same ones that Thompson talks about, unproblematic. And they found the abstractions that we today take for granted as things that are attached to a question mark and whose reliability really has to be subjected to a lot of criticisms. And it's in the 17th century with the rise of Newtonian mechanics and the geocentric view of the world that we then enact this transition. But interestingly, again, from a historical point of view, one of the reasons that there was an explosion of scientific research in the 17th century, it was practical and political. People needed not only better navigational tools for the imperial project of Europe, but also for controlling the problem that was the calendar.
That was awesome. I just learned a lot from what you just said. Okay, so the word capitalism obviously gets thrown around all the time. In some peer groups that we share, David, especially among millennials, it's almost taken for granted that capitalism is like shit, right? There's a stereotype of the liberal coastal elites who hate capitalism, but here we go, dancing around in our designer clothes. And indeed, recent studies have shown that millennials are much, much more likely to be critical of capitalism than their boomer parents, which I think like we sort of already know in a sense, but it's interesting that research is really proving that to be true.
But maybe less than Gen Zers. I don't know how you think about the people for whom we are the boomers.
I know, right? Yeah, the study I'm thinking of didn't talk about Gen Z specifically, so very curious. I would guess that they're even more anti-capitalist than millennials. And in fact, Gen Xers are less anti-capitalist than millennials. So there's this increasing cascade in American generations of positive views towards socialism and negative views towards capitalism. That said, I think a lot of us go around not really understanding exactly what capitalism is. And so I think it would be helpful for us, David, to just talk a little bit about capitalism, what that means, and the sort of phase that we currently find ourselves in with respect to capitalism.
Yeah, and so if we ask a very general question, like what defines capitalism? How should we begin to think about that question? What are the defining features or the signature marks of the capitalist mode of production, either as how Karl Marx understood them in the 19th century or as it's theorized today?
So capitalism first arose among European trading economies in the 16th century and eventually replaced the previous economic system in Europe, which was feudalism. But it really gets going in the way we currently understand it through the Industrial Revolution. So by the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was putting in place the capitalist system as we know it.
And one of the ways in which the transition from a feudal system to a capitalist system of production was enacted was through the overthrow of the guild system. So in very brief terms, it's the idea that you are not rooted to any specific labor through bloodline. And in fact, you can just simply sell your labor time on a market in which other people are bidding for it. So whereas in the feudal system, it's sort of expected that if you're born to a woodworker, you yourself will be a woodworker. So the profession is passed down through the bloodline. Under capitalism, you are a container of labor time, right? That's what you are as an economic subject. You're somebody who has labor time to sell, and you sell it, and it's whoever's buying your time that determines the kind of work that you're going to do. So if my employer wants me to be a waiter, I will be a waiter. If my employer wants me to do construction work, I will do construction work. And that means that the nature of work is a lot more flexible and less static. And that's how you get that transition out of the guild system into what we now call the capitalist system in which people are buying and selling time.
This is such an important point, David, because in the first volume of Capital, Marx talks about how the rise of capitalism is dependent on the free worker. And he means free in a double sense. He says, first off, the free worker is somebody who is able to freely dispose of their own labor power. So I'm able to say, hey, like, I'm a young, strong person. I can wash dishes for you, and or I can do construction for you, and or I can do cognitive labor for you by selling my ideas. So that's one sense in which I'm free. I'm free to dispose of my labor power. But I'm also free in a second sense, which is that I have no other commodity for sale. I am free of all objects that I need in order to realize my labor power. What does this mean? It means that I need to depend on somebody else who owns the means of production in order to realize my labor power. So if I'm washing dishes, I need to be hired at a restaurant that has dishes for me to wash.
Yes, and I think this freedom in the double sense is important to think about in more detail because it introduces both the positive and the negative element of capitalism in relation to the feudal system, which is that it brings with it a certain liberation of the worker. Because, of course, it's a positive that if I am the son of a woodworker, I no longer am fated to that profession. But, of course, it also means that I am dependent on a class, the capitalists, who own the means of production. And according to Marx, this division between the proletarians and the capitalists, which is the fundamental definition of capitalism, is what then introduces a dialectic or a rule of development that creates the increasingly asymmetrical distribution of wealth. And that is because I don't own the means of production. I don't own really anything as an economic subject. Those who do are accumulating more and more and more wealth, which is how you get the division between what today we call the 1 and the 99%.
I think that's really helpful for thinking about the accumulation of wealth as being a fundamental feature of capitalism. So, obviously, capitalism is an economic system, and it's an economic system with the end goal of the accumulation of wealth or capital. You might wonder, well, who's accumulating the wealth? As you said, it is capitalists, the owners of the means of production, rather than workers who are accumulating wealth. And second off, how are these folks accumulating wealth? Well, they're accumulating wealth by making profit through the circulation of commodities, things they sell on the market. So another crucial marker of capitalism is the notion of profit or surplus value. The raw materials of a t-shirt, so the cotton, the thread, etc., and my labor power, let's say it all adds up to $5. If that is not sold for a profit, then we're not living in a capitalist society. The surplus value is what goes beyond the value of the actual materials.
Yeah, the materials plus the time of the labor, right? What Marx calls necessary labor time. So if it takes you, let's say, 2 hours to make that t-shirt, the value of those 2 hours plus the value of the material, that's the cost of production. And it has to be sold at a higher price point in order to create that surplus value. And so this highlights, I think, two additional features of capitalism that are important to mention. One is that the means of production are always owned by the capitalists.
So capitalism has a distinction between the owners of the means of production, which it calls the capitalists, and the workers, the laborers, which are called the proletarians in a sort of traditional Marxian framework.
And that means that the people who produce things don't own either, say, the tools and the factory equipment that they actually use to carry out their work. And more importantly, they don't own the final product that they produce. And this is where Marx introduces the notion of alienation, because the workers under a system of capitalism, by the very rules and by the very logic of capitalism, are alienated.
Exactly. So if I am sewing a t-shirt, I alienate myself from that t-shirt by giving it over for somebody else to buy. And giving it over for somebody else to buy only makes sense if somebody is making a profit from that sale. The rise of capitalism is also linked with the rise in trade among city-states and with the rise of money that goes along with that. So let's say that you and I, David, are from very different parts of the world and we value different things. In order for me to be able to sell you a commodity that I have a lot of in return for something that you have a lot of, it helps for us to have a third thing that can serve as an equivalent of both of those commodities, and that is money. So money presents a universal measuring device for different commodities.
The capitalist model begins and ends with money. And that means that money is the be all and end all of the economy. It's the ultimate good. It's that which starts things and that which we strive for. But whereas that's the case in a capitalist framework, in a pre-capitalist framework, it's the good that really matters. And Marx really captures this distinction in his comparison between antiquity and modernity in Capital. So he looks back to the classical age of Greece and he says, you do have economic exchange, but the point is always to satisfy your needs by having the commodities that you need.
Mm-hmm.
And once you satisfy your needs, that's it. That's the point of the economy. It's the satisfaction of human needs for the sake of the development of the person. In capitalism, that's no longer the case.
Yeah, now it's the accumulation of wealth.
Yes, it's the accumulation of surplus value that drives the economy and that drives the psychology of those who get tangled up in this economic system. And you see this tension in terms of the different treatments of leisure time in pre-capitalist and capitalist economies. And this is Marx's interpretation of the ancient Greeks. He says, in ancient Greek society, people wanted to exchange things so that they would liberate leisure time. The point of living is to have time to do the things that matter to you, the things that are valuable. What are those? I don't know. Pursuing your friendships, being a good citizen, developing your virtue, walking around like Socrates, being a philosopher in the agora, in the public
Hell
sphere.
yeah.
And with the rise of capitalism, you have this transfiguration in what matters. And now, even if you succeed, let's say, at developing a technology that cuts the time that you have to work and you suddenly have more leisure time, you suddenly start using your leisure time, your free time, no longer to develop yourself, but just to produce more wealth.
Money, 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 money.
Money.
So all the things that we've been talking about, David, have to do with capitalism in its traditional modes, the sort of industrial revolution model that Marx is working with. Maybe we can say a little bit about how that develops in the present day, which is a period that some folks will refer to as late capitalism or late stage capitalism. How do you see late capitalism?
Well, one of the ways in which a lot of people talk about late stage capitalism is simply as a continuation and an intensification of the process of economic production and exchange that Marx already described in Capital. So there might be, let's say, new technologies, new industries, new markets, but by and large, the core of capitalism remains the same. It's just that it has reached a higher level of crisis that, according to people who use the term late stage capitalism, means that the end of capitalism, that moment when capitalism meets its internal limit and collapses, is historically closer than it may have been in the 19th century.
Yeah, and I think with the rise of late capitalism, you get the rise of the service sector, so forms of labor that are not manual, but that are cognitive, emotional, etc., as well as the blurred lines between work life and leisure time. I'm out to dinner with a friend and they're checking their phone and they get an email from work and they need to make a call really quickly. Or this rise of the managerial style that brings the whole person to work. Do you know about the
salaried
Google
position, the salary
Yes.
job?
Yes. So salaried as opposed to hourly wage, I think, is a crucial component of this. And you know about the Google campus?
Well, I live in San Francisco, so I have friends who live and breathe Google.
Oh my God. The Google campus is such an exemplar of late capitalism because it illuminates the notion of living at work and of bringing your whole self to work. So The Google campus gives you the options of choosing from all sorts of delicious meals in the dining hall. You can use fancy products in the bathroom. They have an on-site massage therapist. This is blurring the lines between work and play, and it's also blurring your identity as a worker versus your identity as a private individual.
And I never really understood the term late stage capitalism until one of my friends said to me that they do your laundry for you. So you basically show up to work with a dirty pile of laundry, and then by the end of the workday, before you go back home, your laundry is washed and folded. And that means that a lot of the things that are typically considered as belonging to the domestic and private sphere are suddenly part of your work life, and it's something that your employer provides for you in exchange for this assumption that you're bringing your whole person into the workspace.
And like, that sounds pretty awesome, right? But the issue there is uncovered when we think about in whose best interest it is that your laundry be done for you at the workplace. Ultimately, it is in your employer's best interest because you are working more for them. And another feature of late capitalism that I think the Google campus exemplifies is the blurring of the distinction between production and consumption. It's no longer so clear when you are consuming things like consuming leisure through going to see a film, consuming products by buying clothes, and when you are working. Because in the Google campus, you are both producing and consuming at the same time through eating your fancy meal that they're providing for you while doing the cognitive labor that they're requesting.
Yeah, and it means that from a phenomenological perspective, in terms of your lived experience, being at work starts feeling a lot like leisure, especially when there are beanbags everywhere and there's a massage therapist or somebody doing your nails in the corner office. And because you're supposed to bring your whole person, there is no distinction between when you're on or off at work. And that means that your home, in turn, starts looking a lot like an office. And so you move between two buildings, your house building and your work building, but that's just a physical change. It's not actually a change in the content of your activity.
And how much more are we seeing this nowadays with COVID, where the physical demarcation between your workspace and your home space is for many people completely obliterated?
Yeah, except right now there are no massage therapists because of COVID.
Touche.
Enjoying this episode? Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Let's talk temporality. So, what do these features of capitalism that we've just discussed produce as their effects on our very experience of time? How do they imprint us or shape us?
So the first thing that comes to mind is one of the central insights of social theorists who devote themselves to the study of capitalism is this notion that under capitalism, we have an acceleration of experience. So because capitalism is oriented to the production of surplus value, to the production of wealth, it sort of creates this race to the bottom, this rat race, where everybody is constantly moving toward this endpoint that is never reached because you never have enough wealth. And so there's an acceleration of time that is expressed primarily in terms of a directive to work at all times, but secondly, as a sense of despair about the fact that there is no endpoint. There is never that moment that you reach where you can say, I have accumulated enough wealth and thus I can be done working.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting to think about here. The sociologist and political theorist Hartmut Rosa famously delineates three different kinds of acceleration in modern life. He talks about one, technological acceleration. So the way that, for instance, I can now have my laundry done within an hour rather than within 3 hours because I have a machine for that. Two, the acceleration of social change. So the idea that forms of life are rapidly able to shift because of our access to each other on a broader scale than human civilizations have ever seen before. And third, the acceleration of the pace of life. And I think it's that third type, the acceleration of the pace of life, that we're really interested in getting at in this episode, right, David? Because we're talking about the experience of time under late capitalism. Why is it that time feels so fast under capitalism?
Yeah, and I think the way Rosa talks about this that is particularly powerful is the sense that under capitalism, we're not just living in time, but we're constantly out of time. Like, it's always too late. It's too late to begin new things. It's too late to embark on new projects. It's too late to meet the deadlines that we're supposed to meet. So we always have this experience of time as depleted or as running and getting away from us so that we can never fully inhabit it. And so that phenomenological lived component, I think it's essential for thinking about the temporality of late stage capitalism.
And I love your way of putting that, David, because it makes me think about how under capitalism, we're alienated from time itself. I have to already be separate, alienated from time in order to feel like I can kill time, waste time, spend time, save time. All of those ways that we commonly describe our experience of time actually depend on our treating time as an external raw material or resource, a natural resource from which we are separate.
Well, and the point here is that because under capitalism, time has become money, there's always a sense in which if you're simply inhabiting time or spending time without producing wealth, you're wasting time. And that is part of what produces this experience of time getting away from you, because we tend to evaluate our experience of time in terms of the amount of wealth that we've accrued during the passage of whatever time we're talking about. And so it seems as if the things that we should value the most, time to relax, time to see friends, time to just lay back and watch the clouds go by in the sky, it's that time that in fact we feel that we're losing and we try to avoid. We don't want time that is not productive, time that is not generative of surplus value.
Yeah, because the labor process implies breaking time up into chunks. So I'm paid in a traditional capitalist framework by the hour. So my labor is worth X amount of dollars per hour. I can't change how long an hour takes. What I can change is how much labor I can squeeze out within that hour. So the acceleration of the labor process is a crucial feature of the profit-making system of capitalism. But it also ultimately results in the acceleration of time itself.
Well, and I think this goes to what Marx in Capital describes as the voracious appetite of capitalism, which I think is just such a great image of capitalism as this monster that is insatiable and that eats everything that it encounters, and that it just digests things endlessly without considering what is good and what is bad. It just eats and transforms things into shit. And this voracious appetite of capitalism means that we always try to squeeze as much value out of whatever time we have available to us. And this creates an interesting paradox that even though capitalism succeeds at producing technology that reduces the amount of time that we actually have to work, because we have machines that will do the work for us, even though it's reducing the need to work, it also increases the feeling, the need to work. And so we technically could work less under capitalism, but we feel like we have to work more. And
oh my God. Yeah, I just feel like a piece of absolute crap if I'm not like putting in the hours every day, right? There's this strong affective effect that it has on us.
And the psychological component for it is what becomes particularly tricky when we internalize this need to work at all times, because it means that we no longer have the ability to inhabit time in a way that develops the person like the ancient Greeks did. Because we experience any time that we spend with our friends, with our loved ones, looking at art, going to galleries as time that could have been monetized but wasn't.
Mm-hmm. And even if I'm going to a gallery with friends, it's like, well, what am I getting out of this? Is it increasing my value as a person?
Now, Ellie, if we pause for a moment here, we've talked about capitalism and we've talked about temporality. What are ways in which one could potentially, theoretically, just in a hypothetical world, combat this temporality that has suddenly taken over our experience, which is the temporality of late capitalism as we've described it. So what are ways in which someone could, or could someone, resist this specific model of time?
There are none, we're doomed.
Is that a song that I don't know?
I just made it up.
Oh, okay, great. So I for a minute, I thought you knew a song that specifically related to this that I am not familiar with.
Yeah. Yeah, this malady of time, which Franco Berardi, better known as Bifo, talks about as dyschronia. This idea that we're sick of time and we're sick with time. I mean, for one, I'm really interested in the way that the pandemic has actually dissociated us from our capitalist mode of time as a quantifiable resource. I think a lot of folks have been thrust back on themselves through quarantine by the absence of a packed social calendar and a packed work calendar. So I'm wondering if COVID has already forced us into different ways of experiencing time that have liberatory potential. And I definitely don't want to make it seem like, oh, COVID is secretly great. I mean, this is like a totally shit time. 200,000 people have died. Like, this is total bullshit. And is there some glimmer of a new relation of ourselves to time here?
You know, I've heard this argument from a couple of people, from some friends and some academics, and I'm not sure about it because, at least from the people in my immediate surroundings, it's almost as if COVID has only justified capitalist temporality in the sense that people can't wait to go back to the way things used to be, right? Because it was not a chosen experiment, if we want to call it that, a social experiment. It was not something that was taken on with any sense of control or authenticity or resoluteness on our part. And so what I am seeing is a lot of people who already operating under a capitalist framework and already feeling the pressure of economic survival are thrown into this different temporality, typically middle class people that have the privilege of staying at home and not going to work. But again, I wonder whether this experience of COVID has revolutionary potential, or if it's making us yearn for the regimentation of capitalism.
Yeah, I hear you on that, definitely. I do think there is this urge to go back to the way things were. But I also think that many people have been led to reassess their previously packed schedules and start to enjoy certain features of quarantine. So, for instance, in her book, Pressed for Time, Judy Wakeman talks about how quality time cannot be accelerated. So it has this potential to resist the logic of capitalism. And quality time in the American nuclear family imaginary is often figured as time spent with children or loved ones. COVID has forced much more of that, although it's also led to this sort of frenzied pace of life for parents where they're trying to balance work and their family life. And so again, I don't want to glamorize it, but I do think that quality time has emerged more during COVID. And I know in my neighborhood, for instance, my apartment building has started doing a weekly happy hour. We blocked out, using this sort of capitalist mode of blocking out time, 5 to 7 p.m. every Friday is our time to share a happy hour together. And the time that we actually spend together really does resist the accelerated time. We're just kind of shooting the shit. We don't have that much in common. We're a very multi-generational group of people. But our commitment to showing up weekly and just kind of catching up, even though we have so little that's new going on in our lives, I think is a celebration or a festival, an event, in the way that Guy Debord talks about moving away from a society of the spectacle and towards cyclical time. He talks about specular time versus cyclical time. I think cyclical time, as figured by the weekly happy hour I shared with my neighbors, really has for me resisted my drive towards productivity.
I have heard about people engaging in similar new projects with those around them and forging new relationships with people that perhaps typically they would not interact with at all, like their neighbors. I've also known of people who have experienced COVID as a truly alienating experience of time, in part because of the additional pressures that it brings with it. So it's very hard from the standpoint of the person to separate the good from the bad when everything is thrown together. So I wonder, for example, how much quality time you can spend with your kids, even if your kids are at home all day, if you're unsure where your next paycheck is going to come from. The economic conditions, the social conditions on the ground already prevent the production of what we would call quality time. But I do want to remain hopeful about the ways in which the experience of confinement can at least force us to question the naturalness of our typical habits surrounding time.
Yeah, and I think that double-edged sword that you're indicating, David, is really nicely put in an article that came out in Noema Mag in June. There's an article by Venkatesh Rao about time in the pandemic that I think indicates precisely what you're talking about. So Rao first says that pandemic time is a subjectively colored time. And that makes me think like, see, great, we're getting this subjectively colored, textured element of time back that we lost through the accelerated, quantitatively measured time of late capitalism. But then Rao goes on to say this: even within a single apartment building, neighbors experience different temporalities. In one unit, we have a single extrovert experiencing the acute trauma of being forced to work alone from home. Next door, we have parents suddenly juggling childcare and work. At the end of the hall is an immigrant using WhatsApp to track the fate of family members on the other side of the globe who are suddenly physically unreachable due to travel bans. Even members of a single household experience pandemic time differently.
And I think that notion of the multiplicity of the experience of time is important. And it makes me think about a tweet that I read a couple of days ago where somebody said, thinking about the pandemic from the standpoint of my 5-year-old child made me realize something. And that is that I pulled my kid out of school one day. He could not quite understand why, and he's never seen his friends ever since. For obvious reasons, but there is a fundamentally childlike experience of time that is untranslatable into an adult experience of time. And I think that there is a middle class experience of time under COVID that is untranslatable into a low class or a high class experience of time. And some people have made this argument that if you think about the temporality of COVID, it really comes in at least 3 layers. You have the rich people in their vacation homes essentially having the time of their lives because they don't have to worry about anything.
Or at the very least, biding their time.
Yes, exactly. Then you have the middle class hectic experience of time of the people who are working from home, dealing with kids from home, but who don't have quite enough money to afford the space or the care that would make things a lot easier. And then finally, you have the working class experience of time. The people for whom COVID did not even mean confinement, the people who are essential workers and this whole time have been working. So the people who haven't even had the opportunity to experience that thing that the middle class fetishizes as the opportunity to reinvent your values during COVID.
I want to be really careful about this because I think the points you make with respect to class are absolutely fundamental here. But if we could find some sort of solidarity in the fact that we are experiencing this time all together, even if it is showing up for us differently, we could potentially take a broader look at the issues with capitalist time in general and seize the means of production, baby.
Well, hopefully that would be the way in which history is written 30 years from now, that COVID happened. It was a horrible thing. And also later, the Marxist communist revolution arrived.
I do think if we want to say that there is promise in this at all, it is in the fact that lived time obtrudes when our clock time habits are disrupted. When suddenly a meeting is canceled, I feel
a new lease on the next hour. I can sort of do what I want with it. And that might encourage me to live in the present in a way that I otherwise would not have. Because the bottom line is that when we don't know how to fill time, time suddenly fills us.
We are pumped with time.
Ew!
Well,
Okay.
you're the one that said it fills us. So
I know, I didn't mean to gross. I mean it. Okay, I gotta go.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
You can email us with questions, feedback, or even requests for live advice at dearoverthink@gmail.com.
You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter at overthink_pod. We want to thank Anna Koppelman, our production assistant, Samuel P.K. Smith for the original music, and Trevor Ames for our logo.
Thanks so much for joining us today.